Fletcher Tapito.
Thank you, sir. I rise to oppose this part of the legislation. And I just want to underscore and talk about where we've come from to get to this point. This is the third part, in my opinion, sir, of what is a broken attempt on the part of this government to basically claim that they are fixing up the issue of overseas speculators buying up New Zealand homes. So, of course, I'm speaking specifically to Part 2 of the legislation and the amendment. It's around the Income Tax Act. But what we do know, sir, is that Aucklanders are now paying record prices for their homes. And in terms of context of the previous two bits of legislation that are supposedly the panacea to this problem, we come to this third part. But from the two that have already been implemented, because, Mr Chair, this only seeks to establish how those reparations or payments are to be calculated and paid on the part of those overseas speculators, we have already seen, sir, that the bright line legislation does not work. That's right. How do I know that? Because over the months of leading up to Christmas into the new year, we saw legislation implemented, and we saw a slight downturn in terms of purchases of Auckland homes from overseas speculators. We saw that. What we saw, though, was overseas speculators actually just trying to figure out what the legislation meant to them. And basically what they saw, Mr Chairman, was, we only need to get an IRD number and basically that's it. We can still carry on with this speculation and profit out of the Auckland housing market because the requirements on us are minimal and they make no substantive changes to what they are trying to do, and that is use Kiwis' homes as a profit mechanism. That's the gist of it, Mr Chairman. Kiwi homes are being used by overseas speculators for them to make money. And New Zealand First insists that it's not fair and it's not acceptable. Right. And we also have consistently said that this legislation will not work. So here, for example, this bill. The Taxation, Resident Land Withholding Tax, GST, online services and student loan bill. Actually, we support 2/3 of this legislation. And we voted in the first part accordingly, sir. But the reality is the opportunity is here and now for the House, for the Minister, to perhaps break up this legislation. Break it up so that New Zealand First can vote for common sense parts of the legislation, like we acknowledge. We do need to hold student debtors accountable, I think, in contrast to topical issues around tax and trusts at the moment. It's harsh and heavy-handed, but here we are. It's a solution, and what we hold for one student, we must hold for another. Doesn't matter where they're residing. But, sir, specifically to the amendments of the Income Tax Act, these amendments outline the grounds on which payments should be made. Generally speaking, even after all the law changes to supposedly slow speculation in Auckland, recent statistics, I say again, have proven that there has been a minimal or actually no effect on that speculation. So what I want to point out at this stage, it's very general, I acknowledge, so I will come to specifics of the legislation, but what I want to point out in this opportunity to speak to the House is that tax experts came back to the committee, sir, after the alterations and amendments and basically said to the committee, well, not basically, they said it outright, this part of the legislation, this resident withholding land tax, will not work. They said it to our faces. And basically they said it in several ways. They said those who wish to speculate on New Zealand property and profit from it will adjust their behaviour ever so slightly, and in that they referred to the 2-year time period, sir. So they'll just wait. And they'll wait and they'll make more money on it if that's their want. And they'll adjust their behaviour. The other part, sir, was if you look at the statistics and the money generated from this legislation, and here's the rub, this tax revenue legislation bill will, according to KPMG, and others, Mr Chair.
Please tap it over.
Thank you, sir. And others, in fact, will accrue a negative net revenue to the government. It will be a negative tax take. That's what this tax legislation will achieve upon its implementation and once we establish who's liable and how they're going to pay. And there's a whole lot of issues on how we determine who's liable and how they're going to pay. But we'll come to that later. Sir, they gave numbers in line with Inland Revenue's own analysis that suggested anywhere between $1 million to $5 million in terms of revenue gathering from this legislation. So, I mean, $5 million sounds like a lot, but we know in terms of, I mean, that's one house in Auckland at the moment, isn't it? So it's next to nothing. It's ludicrous. And then they put the obvious to us. Well, you're going to have to, there's a cost in gathering this revenue. And actually, what you'll find when you juxtapose cost to revenue, as a good accountant is wont to do, Mr Chairman, is that the actual return to the government coffers will be negative for a piece of legislation that we have been told will not work because behaviour from speculators will change, sir. So New Zealand First cannot and will not support absolutely farcical measures, if you don't mind the language, sir, in terms of a government standing up and essentially saying they'll do something about it, and in fact knowing full well that they will not achieve any of the stated objectives that they have set out before us today. Thank you.